In our first episode, we explored the uneasy partnership between Russia and China, a relationship shaped by history, rivalry, and necessity. In our second, we returned to Europe, to the morning when tanks rolled across the Ukrainian border and the post-Cold War order finally cracked. Today, in Episode 3, we follow the consequences of that fracture eastward to the vast stretch of land between Moscow, Beijing, and the steppes of Central Asia, to a region where another kind of order has been quietly taking shape. In this episode, we examine how the Shanghai Cooperation Organization evolved from a simple border agreement into the world's largest authoritarian coalition. How the color revolutions of the 2000s convinced Russia, China, and their neighbors that democracy itself was a threat. And how the war in Ukraine pushed these states even closer together, not through open alliance, but through shared fears, shared tactics, and a shared commitment to regime survival. We explore how this organization reshapes Eurasia, how it delegitimizes protest, how it brands dissent as extremism, and how it provides its members with a political shield against Western pressure. This is the story of a world drifting deeper into fragmentation, a world where democracies and autocracies move further apart, where competing regional blocs take form, and where the ideologies shaping the 21st century collide in slow motion. Welcome to Episode 3 of A Dark Dawn. The Rise of the Shanghai Spirit. In the early 2000s, something extraordinary shook the political landscape of the former Soviet world. Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, 3 nations, 3 uprisings, 3 revolutions that unfolded not with armies and bloodshed, but with crowds, color, and the quiet force of people refusing to accept the old order. For the first time since the Soviet collapse, entrenched post-communist elites were pushed aside not by coups, but by citizens. To many, this was democracy's new dawn in Eurasia. But to others, it was a nightmare. These protests were not isolated events. They were signals, and signals, for any authoritarian regime, are warnings written in fire. The Kremlin watched the rose, orange, and tulip revolutions with growing dread. To Moscow, they were not grassroots movements. They were Western-engineered operations, American fingerprints on every banner, every election monitor, every NGO printing pamphlets. In the Russian imagination, these revolutions were not democratic awakenings. They were geopolitical offensives, rehearsals for Moscow's own undoing. In Beijing, the alarm bells rang just as loudly. If a government could fall in Tbilisi, or Kyiv, or Bishkek, what stopped the same tide from reaching Xinjiang, Tibet, or even the inner core of the Chinese Communist Party? Revolutions, Beijing understood, are like viruses. They spread across borders, carried by hope, uncertainty, and the sight of others standing up. And across Central Asia, from Astana to Tashkent, presidents and strongmen saw something even more threatening than liberal ideals. They saw a template for collapse, crowds in the streets, defections in the elite, elections turning into referendums on legitimacy, a society that, with enough pressure, could simply decide it was done, obeying. And so one question echoed through ministries and presidential palaces across the steppe. What must we do to make absolutely sure this never happens here? The answer would take form over the next decade, not as a democratic wave, but as its mirror opposite, a new kind of regional order built not to empower citizens, but to reinforce regimes. An alliance designed not to spread freedom, but to vaccinate states against it. A political machine that fused security services, information control, shared intelligence, and mutual legitimacy. This machine would strengthen borders, harden elites, synchronize narratives, and eventually coalesce into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as we know it today. The world's first international organization explicitly structured to stabilize authoritarian rule. A shield against revolutions, a firewall against dissent, a lesson learned from 3 uprisings that shook every autocrat from Moscow to Beijing. It began modestly, almost innocently, as the Shanghai Five, a practical arrangement forged in the mid-1990s to settle the last Soviet-Chinese border disputes lingering after the USSR's collapse. 5 states meeting quietly, signing agreements, demarcating frontier lines once drenched in Cold War suspicion. But by 2001, something fundamental shifted. Uzbekistan joined the group, and suddenly it wasn't just about borders anymore. The meetings grew larger, the ambitions broader, the purpose deeper. And in June of that year, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, was born. From the very first day, its founding documents were notable not for what they said, but for what they didn't. There was no language about strengthening democracy, no promises of free and fair elections, no commitments to human rights or political participation, the hallmarks of Western-led institutions. Instead, the SCO elevated 2 principles above all others: stability, non-interference, neutral words, on paper. But in the hands of regimes fearful of their own citizens, those words take on a very different meaning. The SCO Charter spoke of sovereignty, territorial integrity, mutual respect, and different paths of development. Diplomatic phrases polished to perfection. Yet beneath that calm surface, a new set of norms was being quietly constructed, norms that would define the post-Soviet space for the next 2 decades. Norms that said, you do not criticize how another member governs. You do not assist, encourage, or even sympathize with their opposition. You do not question their elections, their media controls, or their security forces. And any attempt to promote democracy here, from civic groups, foreign NGOs, or Western governments, is not assistance. It is interference. It is subversion. It is a threat to regional stability. This was not international cooperation in the traditional sense. This was a collective insurance policy for authoritarianism, a shared commitment to protect each other from the very forces that had toppled regimes in Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan. A political firewall, a vaccine against revolution, a shield designed to keep the idea of the color revolutions as far away as possible. Its architects called this new ideological foundation the Shanghai Spirit, a polite name for a very powerful idea. Officially, the Shanghai Spirit reads like a manifesto for harmony, mutual trust, mutual benefit, equality, respect for multi-civilizational diversity. On paper, it sounds gentle, even enlightened, a set of values designed to bridge cultures across the vast Eurasian continent. But beneath those soft diplomatic phrases lies a hard and unmistakable truth. The Shanghai Spirit is the ideological blueprint for a 21st century authoritarian order, a doctrine crafted not to empower societies, but to protect regimes from the forces that toppled governments in Tbilisi, Kyiv, and Bishkek. It rests on 3 intertwined pillars: stability above all, diversity of political systems, absolute sovereignty, first stability above all. In the Shanghai Spirit, stability is not merely a priority. It is the oxygen of the state. And anything that threatens that oxygen becomes an existential danger. A peaceful protest, a demand for accountability, a call for fair elections. None of these are viewed as political actions. They are framed as disruptions, sparks that could ignite chaos. By simply redefining dissent as instability and instability as extremism or terrorism, the state acquires unlimited justification for its response. Opposition ceases to be political. It becomes a security threat. A threat best handled not with debate or reform, but with police, courts, and intelligence services. This first pillar turns authoritarianism into self-defense. The second is diversity of political systems. At first glance, this sounds like a tolerant idea, a celebration of pluralism. But within the SCO's ideological universe, diversity means something else entirely. It means every government has the right to define its own democracy, no matter how hollow the word becomes. Russia's tightly managed elections, China's one-party rule, Turkmenistan's absolute dictatorship, Uzbekistan under Karimov's iron grip. Each is simply a unique path, a cultural model, a national tradition. The Shanghai Spirit transforms authoritarian practices into legitimate and culturally authentic choices. What the West calls repression, the SCO calls diversity. 3. Absolute sovereignty. The third pillar is the shield that protects the first two. Under the Shanghai Spirit, sovereignty is sacred, not as a balance between state and citizen, but as a wall between the state and the outside world. No criticism is acceptable. No external pressure is legitimate. No NGO may observe elections. No human rights group may investigate abuses. Democracy promotion becomes interference. Support for civil society becomes subversion. International monitoring becomes hostile influence. In this worldview, authoritarianism is not a flaw. It is a sovereign right. These three pillars form the intellectual architecture of the Shanghai Spirit. A world where autocracies no longer justify themselves, but stand tall as fully valid political systems, worthy not only of survival, but of international protection. World where regimes link arms to shield one another from scrutiny, criticism, and the dangerous idea that citizens might choose a different future. The defining moment for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization did not come in a conference room or through a carefully negotiated treaty. It came in the streets. Spring 2005, a season when Central Asia shook. First Kyrgyzstan, then Uzbekistan. Two uprisings, very different in character, but identical in what they revealed about the SCO's true purpose. Kyrgyzstan, the Tulip Revolution. In March 2005, frustration that had been simmering for years finally boiled over. Rigged parliamentary elections, corruption, a president, Askar Akayev, who had once spoken the language of reform but had long since abandoned it. Crowds surged into the streets. Protests spread city by city. Within days, the government collapsed. Akayev fled the country. There was no civil war, no insurgency, no descent into anarchy. It was sudden, yes, chaotic at moments, but it was a mass political uprising, not a security crisis. Yet the SCO insisted otherwise. In official statements, in press conferences, in the rhetoric of its leaders, the Tulip Revolution was portrayed as a destabilizing event, a signal that extremist forces were exploiting political weaknesses. Not a democratic movement, but a threat, not a civic awakening, but a rehearsal for disorder. The SCO had found its narrative. Uzbekistan, the Andijan massacre. 2 months later, the region erupted again. In the city of Andijan, local businessmen were arrested under questionable charges. Protesters gathered in the central square, families, children, elderly citizens, demanding justice. What happened next remains one of the darkest moments in post-Soviet history. President Islam Karimov sent in the troops. Gunfire, panic, bodies in the streets. According to eyewitnesses and independent observers, more than 500 civilians were killed. The Uzbek government claimed they were terrorists. And the SCO, instead of challenging the narrative, endorsed it. Statements from SCO officials repeated the regime's framing word for word. This was not a massacre, not an abuse of power, not a crime against civilians. It was, they said, a fight against the three evil forces: terrorism, separatism, extremism. No condemnation, no inquiry, no pressure for transparency, only solidarity with the authoritarian. The Astana Summit, July 2005. By the summer, the meaning was unmistakable. At the SCO summit in Astana, leaders delivered a coordinated message. Regime survival was the organization's top priority. They formally demanded that the United States close its base in Kyrgyzstan. They denounced external interference in domestic politics. They affirmed that instability, whether protests or massacres, must be handled internally without foreign criticism. This was the Shanghai Spirit revealing its true shape, not a doctrine of harmony, not a bridge between civilizations, but an ideology of collective authoritarian defense, forged in real time in the crucible of Kyrgyzstan's revolution and sealed with blood in the streets of Andijan. By the mid-2000s, something unprecedented had taken shape across the Eurasian landmass. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, a regional bloc emerged that did not hide its suspicion of democracy, but built itself against it. Russia and China, the SCO's twin pillars, led the charge. Central Asia's rulers, still shaken by color revolutions, fell in line eagerly. Together they constructed a political culture that delegitimizes protest before it even starts, a legal toolkit that redefines dissent as extremism, an ideological shield that dismisses Western criticism as interference, a regional alliance that normalizes authoritarian governance as a valid, sovereign choice. The SCO was never just a forum. It was a mechanism, a design, a machine built to insulate regimes from the forces that might overthrow them. Inside this machine, authoritarian governments could reinforce one another, share tactics and intelligence, coordinate narratives, and collectively resist democratic pressure. Where the European Union promotes democratic integration, the SCO promotes authoritarian preservation. Here, NATO speaks of shared democratic values. The SCO speaks of diversity, not as tolerance, but as the right to govern without scrutiny. The Shanghai Spirit is, in many ways, the anti-liberal mirror of the post-war Western order, a doctrine designed not to expand freedom, but to contain it. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is expanding. Iran is now a full member. India and Pakistan have entered the fold, bringing a third of humanity with them. Turkey hovers at the edge. Saudi Arabia and Egypt express interest. Even dialogue partners like Qatar, the UAE, and Bahrain are circling the bloc. At the heart of this expansion is not culture, not trade, not geography. It is an emerging authoritarian worldview, a worldview that challenges the universality of human rights, the legitimacy of democratic revolutions, the very idea that citizens may remove their rulers, and the West's long-standing claim to define global norms. What the SCO has built in Central Asia may be only the prototype, a laboratory for a new kind of regional order, a blueprint for a multipolar world in which liberal democracies no longer set the rules. In that world, regime stability outweighs freedom. Sovereignty shields repression. Diversity of systems becomes a polite phrase for dictatorship. And the Shanghai Spirit grows from a regional doctrine into a rising global ideology, another chapter in the larger story of our darkening dawn. The rise of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the consolidation of authoritarian power across Eurasia, and the widening rift between democratic and non-democratic worlds is not a finished story. It is still unfolding, quietly in some places, violently in others, and its full consequences are only beginning to come into view. The choices being made right now in Beijing, Moscow, Ankara, Delhi, Brussels, and Washington will shape the architecture of the next world order. If this episode helped you make sense of these shifting dynamics, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It supports the podcast and ensures you'll be with us as we follow this emerging divide, step by step, country by country, fault line by fault line. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and join me next time as we continue to map the forces reshaping our world. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us as we explore the contours of a world entering a dark dawn.